Picture the most beloved bar in television history. Everybody knows your name there. The laughter never stops. And standing behind that bar, in a crisp suit, speaking like a Harvard professor, is a man the whole world adores. But what the cameras never showed you was a man barely holding himself together. Kelsey Grammer built one of the most iconic characters in TV history, Dr. Fraser Crane. 20 years in the role, 6 Emmys. A voice so smooth, so composed, that millions of people trusted him instantly. But behind that voice was a childhood soaked in tragedy. A father murdered when Kelsey was just 13. A sister raped and killed only a few years later. And a grief so heavy, he tried to drown it. In cocaine, in alcohol, in anything that would make the pain stop. While America watched him deliver perfect punchlines, his own castmates were quietly staging interventions to save his life. No one expected this from someone like him. He would arrive at the studio looking like his world was falling apart. Then the director would call action, and somehow, impossibly, brilliance would pour out of him, every word sharp, every line perfect. Then, cut, and he'd disappear again. Back into the wreckage. One of his closest co-stars watched this happen, year after year, and it broke something between them that took 30 years to repair. This is the real story of how a man built comedy gold out of unbearable pain, and almost lost everything doing it. Kelsey Grammer was born in 1955 on the island of St. Thomas. His parents divorced when he was only 2. He grew up mostly with his mother and grandfather, first in New Jersey, then Florida. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary childhood. It was anything but. He found his escape in performance. Shakespeare, language, the stage. He earned a spot at Juilliard, one of the most prestigious performing arts schools in the world, then moved into regional theater, then Broadway. By the early 80s, he was working steadily. Soap operas, small roles, the slow climb most actors know all too well. Nothing about it screamed future icon. Then, in 1984, everything changed. A casting director brought him in for a small role on a hit NBC sitcom called Cheers. He was only supposed to appear for 6 episodes, a minor character, a stepping stone. But what happened next changed everything. Dr. Fraser Crane, the pompous, eloquent, endlessly quotable psychiatrist, became one of the most beloved characters on television. Grammer stayed until Cheers ended in 1993, then carried the character into his own spin-off, Frasier, for 11 more years. To audiences, he was untouchable, elegant, in total control. 6 Emmys, 3 Golden Globes, one of the richest per-episode salaries in television history. But long before any of that fame arrived, Grammer had already survived more loss than most people face in a lifetime. And that loss didn't disappear just because the cameras loved him. It followed him onto every set he ever walked onto. And slowly, the people working closest to him began to notice that something wasn't right. To understand what was really happening behind the scenes at Cheers, you have to go back further. To 1968, Kelsey Grammer was just 13 years old when his father was shot and killed at his home in the Virgin Islands. During a wave of racial violence following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., a teenager, thousands of miles from any real support, was suddenly without a father. Then, in 1975, tragedy struck again. His younger sister, Karen, only 18, was raped and murdered while working a shift in Colorado. Grammer was 20 years old. 2 of the people he loved most, taken by violence, only 7 years apart. He has said, decades later, that he never properly grieved either death. There was no space for it, no roadmap for how a young man processes that kind of horror. So instead, He buried it. By the time he landed the role of Fraser Crane in 1984, Grammer was already carrying wounds most of his castmates knew nothing about, and it didn't take long for those wounds to start showing. In 1988, at the height of Cheers' popularity, Grammer was arrested for drunk driving and cocaine possession. A short jail sentence, mandatory rehab. For a rising star on one of the most watched shows in America, it was a very public unraveling. But it wasn't a wake-up call. Not yet, because just a few years later, it happened again. And this time, it would be even harder to hide. In January 1991, Grammer was hit with 2 additional years of probation. The reason? He had violated his original probation. Cocaine again. To the public, he was still Dr. Fraser Crane. Witty, refined, in complete command of every room. But off camera, cast and crew were watching a very different man struggle to hold himself together. And that's when things started to fall apart. Writer Dan O'Shannon, who worked closely with him, later described it in haunting detail. Grammer would arrive at the studio looking like his life was in pieces. Then the director would call action, and in an instant, he'd snap into Fraser, delivering complex, articulate dialogue with total precision. Then, cut would be called, and he'd fade right back into whatever chaos he'd walked in with. It was like watching 2 different people occupy the same body. Minute by minute, his co-star Bebe Neuwirth and writer Ken Levine would later confirm what many suspected. His erratic behavior was causing real delays, missed rehearsals, unpredictable moods, a production quietly trying to hold together a hit show, while managing a star who was clearly in crisis. Eventually, it reached a breaking point the cast couldn't ignore any longer. They staged an intervention. Not once. Reportedly, more than once. Cast members and producers sitting down with Grammer, trying to reach the man buried underneath the addiction, before it cost him everything. But even the people who cared about him most couldn't stop what was coming next. In September 1996, years after that first arrest, Kelsey Grammer crashed his Dodge Viper while intoxicated. It could have killed him. This time, something shifted. He checked himself into the Betty Ford Center and spent 30 days there trying to confront an addiction that had quietly run his life since his early 20s. It was, by all accounts, a real turning point. But not an instant fix. Recovery rarely is, and the damage from those years had already left scars on the relationships closest to him. One of those relationships was with his Cheers co-star, Ted Danson. For 30 years, there was a distance between them. A quiet, unresolved tension neither man fully explained in public. On screen, fans saw wit and rivalry between Sam Malone and Fraser Crane. What they never saw was that off-screen, something had genuinely fractured. It wasn't a dramatic blow-up. It was something quieter, and in some ways sadder. A friendship that simply couldn't survive what Grammer was going through, but the truth behind it was far more human than anyone expected. In 2024, on a podcast reunion with Danson and fellow Cheers star Woody Harrelson, the 2 men finally addressed the rift that had followed them for 30 years. Danson admitted something that had clearly weighed on him for decades, a moment where he'd confronted Grammer, one that left things tense between them for far longer than either of them expected. "I feel like I missed out on the last 30 years of Kelsey Grammer," Danson said. Then, in early 2025, Grammer went further. He finally explained his side of it. He revealed that during that period, he was drinking heavily, dealing with what he called deep self-doubt and self-loathing. Danson had approached him on set and told him, plainly, that he was frustrated Grammer wasn't always showing up ready to work. Grammer said he respected the honesty. There was no shouting match, no explosive fight, just a hard truth from a friend, at a moment when Grammer wasn't in a place to fully hear it. But that conversation stayed with both of them, quietly, for 3 decades. The truth wasn't a scandal. It was something far more relatable. The story of an addiction slowly costing a man relationships he didn't even realize he was losing, one small moment at a time, and what he chose to do with all of it, decades later, would surprise people who only knew him as Fraser Crane. In 2025, Grammer published a memoir titled Karen, A Brother Remembers. For the first time, he wrote openly about his sister's murder, his father's death, and the addiction that consumed his 20s and 30s. The man who spent his career playing someone endlessly composed finally let the world see what was underneath. Today, Kelsey Grammer is in his 70s. Decades removed from that crash, that jail cell, those interventions, he's rebuilt his career across film, theater, and television, even returning to the role of Fraser Crane one more time in 2023. He and Ted Danson have found their way back to something resembling peace, 30 years after one hard conversation drove them apart. But maybe the most remarkable part of his story isn't the awards or the comeback. It's that a man who lost his father to violence, his sister to violence, and very nearly lost himself to addiction, found a way to keep going, and eventually found the courage to tell the truth about it. Behind every perfectly delivered punchline was a man fighting a war nobody could see. So, what do you think? Does knowing the real story behind Fraser Crane change the way you see him? Would you have guessed that one of TV's most composed characters was played by a man carrying that much pain? Let us know in the comments, and if you want more real stories about the people behind the characters you grew up watching, subscribe. We're telling more of these every week.